Hello everyone, welcome to this new video. In today's episode, we're gonna discuss China plus one. Many SMEs are right now considering diversifying their supply chain and they're gonna look for neighboring countries. We can think about Mexico, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and many others. Some countries may be very relevant for specific product, but others should be really excluded. And today to discuss this topic, I have Vin Ho. Vin has an extensive experience into supply chain. He's been living in Vietnam for a couple of years. Right now, Vin is in Vietnam and we're gonna discuss about that. Hey mate, I'm very happy to have you today.
Hey Guillaume, how you doing? Welcome back.
Okay, so Vin, let's start by an overview. What are basically some of the major advantages for companies who are right now sourcing and manufacturing products in China to look to diversify their supply chain?
As you've seen, GM, China is on the enemies list in the United States and other countries in the last few years, especially when Trump rose up. He's kind of chosen and defined China as the enemy, and we don't really want to do business with him, so to speak. So there's lots of high tariffs on Chinese imported goods. So right now, companies are looking for an alternative, as you mentioned. So right now, in the last 3 or 4 years, is when it began.
So tariff will be the main criteria, right? So many companies will be looking when they will imported products in the US to reduce the tariff. So it's going to come from the origin of the goods. So if a good is made in Vietnam, for instance, the tariff will be different from a good made in China. Can you elaborate that?
Yeah, so right now, there are quite high tariffs for Chinese made goods across the board. And then Trump just recently increased it 10% starting on February 4th. So already lots of components, parts, and products from China imported into the United States are more expensive. And that's on top of tariffs that were in place in 2018 when he came to power. And we saw that through the Biden administration too. So Biden increased tariffs on, for example, solar products 50% and then 100% for electrical vehicles or EVs. So we have more or higher tariffs on Chinese products as well as the demographics of China at the same time that's happening simultaneously. So the labor force, the cost is increasing and as well as the labor force is shrinking or decreasing. So Chinese population is getting older, and it wasn't like in the maybe 20 or 30 years ago when it was at its peak in terms of population. So yes, so tariffs are taking effect and causing maybe companies to look elsewhere, look at China, but at the same time look at an alternative sourcing country.
Okay, so yeah, it's very good input that tariff may be sometimes the main driver, but you will also have companies just because they want to allocate risks in different manufacturing countries that will also look for this diversification. You can find better cost structure in some countries. You can have also specialties and know-how that some countries will be more suitable than other. And then we can maybe roll some of the countries that are the best alternative outside of China, and maybe we can start by a common country that we've been both about Vietnam. What are, according to you, Vin, some of the advantages into manufacturing in Vietnam?
Yeah, right away, many people looked towards Vietnam because it's one, the location is just south geographically of China, and two, Vietnam has been moving up into the low cost manufacturing industries. And Vietnam is advantageous because it has quite a young population and a much lower labor cost and all of that compared to China. So 3, 4, 5 years ago, many people started to look towards Vietnam, and then right away, Vietnam has advantages in certain industries such as maybe textiles, home and garden, and furniture, or anything like that.
We can also add to this list footwear and then a growing demand for electronics as well. So this is some of the key sectors that you can find in Vietnam. And related to the advantages we have, so as you mentioned, cost of labor that will be lower than in China. You also have a one-party government, so it also brings stability to companies who are either setting up offices, manufacturing plants, or just for a sourcing perspective, working with Vietnamese suppliers. And you also have all the free trade agreements that are finally linking to the tariff that we initially announced. We have EVFTA for Europe, for instance. We have the CPTPP for North America, and those trade agreements are favorable for import-export relationships. Vin, what are probably the downside of manufacturing in Vietnam for people who are already having Chinese sources and they are looking to diversify to Vietnam?
Vietnam is an opportunity, but it's not a silver bullet for a lot of people. One is because of the size. It's 1/10 the size of China, and it doesn't have the workforce, the labor force that can do what China does very, very well, because China is so big and has a large population. And in the last 20, 30 years, China has modernized very quickly their ports, their infrastructure, the manufacturing. They have a high level of manufacturing a lot of products, a large quantity for a low cost. And so they have these expertise that they have built in the last 20 or 30 years. So when you move to Vietnam, that's a different story. Maybe the last 10 or 15 years, Vietnam has started to get into manufacturing, has started to open up to the rest of the world. So though the labor is cheap, there are now a lot of companies moving into Vietnam. And so finding these workers is more difficult. For example, Nike or Adidas, maybe they have, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 workers. In the past, they pay them low salary, but nowadays they have more options, more opportunities to go to different factories and work in different industries. So then now the competition is on to find the labor force, the skilled labor.
Yeah, it's very good input, Vin. Other differences compared to China may also be on the MOQ aspect and then the scale. When you are going to Chinese manufacturers, you can probably directly place an order of dozens of containers. But if you go to Vietnam, companies that are able to produce dozens of containers will be just a few for each key verticals. And then it can also be on the flip side an advantage, meaning that you have a new entrant. In Vietnam, you have small factories that will be able to produce mixed variety of items and allowing lower quantities. But then they may not have all the machinery, the know-how, the engineer, and then also just if they want to do tech pack, you may not have the same skills that you have in China. In Vietnam, you may have to hire someone who can do all the drawing, do the tech pack, so technical specification, and send them to the factory for sampling. Where if you go to China, you may have a one-stop shop and then a factory that will also with English-speaking people and then the engineer team being able to really provide you the A to Z, so you have a one point of contact and then you can place an order.
As you mentioned, a lot of good points, Guillaume. China is very much more sophisticated. They've been in the game longer, and they've got these expertise to help a lot of companies scale and produce large quantities. And they're good at what they do. They stay very, very competitive. Vietnam, the advantages, again, would be lower cost in terms of labor, but you might lose out on some of the sophistication in manufacturing. It really depends, though. I mean, it may be electronics or other things like that, or maybe low-cost manufacturing. You might be able to find more or source more, or might be able to help you out with your factory.
Now let's move to a different country. I think right now Mexico is also getting a lot of attention just because of its proximity to the US. So probably many companies that were often before sourcing overseas and sourcing far in Asia just because of the time differences to deal with suppliers and then all the freight costs that will be added on the top of the value. Probably US-based companies are also sourcing more locally, and either they can source domestically in the US or also neighboring countries just like Mexico. What are your observations and then trends that are happening in this country?
Yes, we've seen the rise of Mexican factories quite a bit the last, I would say, 5 or 8 years. For many reasons, as you mentioned, the proximity to the American market, and Mexico has a large population, and a lot of the Asian companies from China and South Korea have moved or are moving into Mexico near the border. And so they're setting up factories and warehouses. So if they can get goods shipped there and manufactured there or assembled there and then go over the border at Laredo and then into the United States, that's a cost advantage as well as the tariff. So before we had the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and that changed when Trump came into office. I think around 2019, he signed off on something called the USMCA, US, Mexico, and Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So that is an agreement where there's lower tariffs, lower costs, and there's lots of supply chains going back and forth between those three countries. So you might be manufacturing in Mexico, you ship it to the US, and then there's maybe some tests, you ship it to Canada, and they ship it back to the United States for retail and final consumption. So we see a lot of that happening. And now, like you said, Mexico is playing a large part in that process.
And then related to the product categories, do you have any input about how Mexico can be good for sourcing from the US?
Yeah, I think lots of the big categories are like some electronics, everyday household items, could be washers, dryers, could be fans, anything like that. I know there's some high tech being built along the border. I know of a South Korean chip maker that is based out of there. So we've seen textiles in the past, or at least assembly along the border in Mexico. So it's lots of industries. It's quite diverse. Of course, the labor is a little bit more expensive than Vietnam and China, but the advantage would be the proximity, same time zone, and all of those cost savings.
So we talk about the advantages. Now, what can be the disadvantages? I have in mind, for instance, the bureaucracy, the red tape, and also just the corruption that can be in those countries quite significant. Do you have anything to share about that?
First thing that comes to mind is maybe the safety or the violence, along the northern part of Mexico, the cartels, lots of large cities. It's not very, very safe. Maybe I'm painting a broad stroke and it's not like that everywhere, but generally what I've heard in the news, and then people, Mexicans that I've worked with in my company, they explain things to me, they tell me things about the violence. You might be okay at the larger touristy cities or touristy areas, and most people I think are fine. They're okay, but violence and corruption, some of those aspects could kind of maybe make things more difficult of doing business in Mexico.
Okay, great, Vin. Now let's move to another country. And for instance, we can consider Indonesia. Indonesia, for outdoor products, it can be a very suitable country. And then you have a lot of patio and then indoor, outdoor furniture that are manufactured in Indonesia just because of the local raw materials, wood. And then what about this country as an alternative supply chain outside of China?
Yeah, I think Indonesia has been rising and there's lots of opportunity there too. They have a large population, good demographics in terms of a lot of young people. Um, but there are a lot of challenges. I don't know what Indonesia can do very well in terms of what specific industries. I know that they do make some products, but again, it's not on scale as China. And it depends on the workforce because not everyone is trained or not everyone wants to work in manufacturing. And so it's a diverse industry in terms of services and manufacturing and specific industries.
Yeah, that's the same input I got. I think for Indonesia, they are not so high in terms of high-tech manufacturing. So it's going to be mostly the low type of manufacturing. And then just because the country is spread between different islands, sometimes it can add up costs. If you are sourcing from one island and then you need to consolidate multiple suppliers into a single container, it may immediately add domestic costs just to consolidate and do those logistics arrangement. So in the end, if you are sending a container from Indonesia, it may cost you higher than if you are looking to a country just like Vietnam, who can also have the same raw materials and then cheap labor cost to also produce at a discounted price. And now, Vin, let's move to the fourth country that is also often quoted as a potential supply chain alternative outside of China, and it's about India. There is a lot of rivalry between who will be the next rising star. Is it Vietnam? Is it India? Where are the semiconductors going? Are they going to India? Are they going to Vietnam? What are your observations about the manufacturing aspect in India?
Yeah, I think India poses a lot of opportunities, but again, the situation, the story is much more complex. Yes, we've seen a rise in the Indian economy and it's got a large population. I think it overtook China, in fact, has the largest population in the world and lots of skilled labor. So we see manufacturing, there's a trend that's moved there. But again, it's going to depend because in terms of low cost manufacturing, maybe not so much compared to Vietnam. I think the Indian population is a little bit more educated, a little bit more skilled, trained, and so I think you're going to get more into services, and some parts are going to be more into technology. So I think opportunities are there, but for manufacturing, maybe I don't know as much. Again, maybe making a stereotype or using a brush stroke, but maybe there are opportunities. But when I was working in a company for China based in Vietnam, we had an India representative, and I remember there's some tools and some manufacturing products that were made in India, but again, the pricing wasn't always cheap, wasn't always competitive where we could get in alternative places. So again, India has a lot of opportunity. Depends on the industry. It depends on the product and the supply chain and support behind that.
Yeah, I think product category wise, I think India can be well positioned for textile apparels. I know they also do a lot of chemicals. We have actually a client who is sourcing indoor furniture over there. The only thing that sometimes the quality at the inside we get is not as high as in Vietnam. They may not have the same sophistication and then detail to quality and to craftsmanship that finally won't make it necessarily a good alternative if you look for high quality products at a good price. So now, Vin, let's move to the fifth and last country, and it's about Turkey. So Turkey, just similar as Mexico to the US, Turkey is just as the front door to the Europe. So it may also be a good alternative if you are doing, for instance, textile. I know they do a lot of furniture over there. So just because you are closer to the final destination, if you are selling, for instance, in Europe, it can also make it a relevant country for a China plus one strategy. What are your inputs about this country?
Yeah, what I've heard is Turkey has opportunity in that lower cost, a large population, and then geographically the proximity to the large markets of Western and Northern Europe. So the labor is affordable, but then again, we have to look at specifically at the industry or the products that Turkey can make. I don't know if it's textiles. I've heard of that in the last few years, but that's the only industry that I know of. I just need to study and know more. I don't know the exact specifics in terms of manufacturing in Turkey, but I know there is cost savings. There are opportunities there too.
So you're right, Vin, that just because of the position and then the location of Turkey in that Middle East, it really creates a bridge between the East and the West. And it's also a way to also diversify probably part of the production and then be closer to Europe. So also save into the logistics aspect. But regarding to the cost, probably lower than on the Western Europe, but it may not be as the level as what you can find in Asia. Now, Vin, let's take a bit of perspective and then consider a company that is already manufacturing in China. What could be the scenario and then the roadmap that you will tell them if they want to start to diversify and look for China plus one strategy?
Yeah, I think there are three or four things that come to mind that you have to do. The first would definitely be the market research. You know, as we've just discussed upon, there are a lot of countries, there are a lot of opportunities, but they don't necessarily have the exact product that you might be looking for or the industry. You know, for example, China does well at toys, electronics. Vietnam might do well in home and garden products. They might do well in furniture, et cetera, et cetera. So market research would be the first thing to look at. And then you probably want to look at the QC in terms of quality control and the standards and the factory technology. Are they able to produce what you're looking for to your standards? And then the third and that I would look for is in terms of the logistics compliance, the supply chain, and the support behind that in order to get your goods, the reliability. And then on top of that, it'd be the partnerships, the people that you can work with. If you have good contacts and you have a good team that can look, you know, in the future and then for long-term relationships, then that might help you in terms of determining which countries and which factories to work with alternatively to China. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the roadmap that you draw is pretty clear and then straightforward. I think I will also start by the market study, so understand about the pros and cons on each country. What are the current source and how can you smoothly transition or at least allocate to manufacturers based outside of where you are doing it at the moment. And then after from this country, I will just try to take a tour. So I will try to attend to trade show or organize a tour to visit potential manufacturers in the country, bring with me the tech pack or even the physical samples, and then try to look for suppliers that I will be able to reproduce that. And after that, as you say, you will need to put a strong emphasis on QC. So probably hire a third-party team in country that can also take care of the entire scope of the production, and just make sure that as soon as you keep transitioning from your current country to this new country, you have the same processes, SOP in place. So you make sure that your end client won't see any differences between making it in China or making it elsewhere. So I think that's probably one of the roadmap that we will suggest companies and SMEs to follow. Do you have a last word, Vin, to close this conversation?
Yeah, as you can see, China plus one strategy, even though it's desired, but we've just discussed 5 alternative countries, but it's quite complex and it's not that easy. Yes, tariffs take a toll and it might increase costs and etc. And it might be hard to do business with China in the future. But again, it's not all that easy, and you have to do your research. And like you said, Guillaume, you have to go there physically to a trade show, build some partnerships, visit the country, and then reach out to other services that might be able to assist you.
So I agree with you, Vin. I think this China plus one strategy is not always simple. You will need to really spend time into studying the different markets and where you should go, and then also going step by step into transitioning your current supply chain to an alternative country. And I think just like any transition, it will take time. So if this is a plan to just save 10% of tariffs that you will have at the moment because Trump just made an announcement, that's not the right way to go. I think you should be looking for a long-term plan and still keep your current sources, for instance, in China, and then step by step, months after months, years after years, try to allocate your current manufacturing to different countries. So you're also having a portfolio of manufacturing bases that can grow over time and be efficient for the long run. Thanks, mate, for all your inputs today. I will leave below in the description more details about our product and services. If you are interested, you can check this out.
Great. Thanks, Guillaume.
Thanks, mate.
Down and I'ma get it right. Then I'll sight like